Hi, it's Dave Hargadell. Welcome to day 2 of the homeschool conference. This has really been so much fun. 3 keynotes in back-to-back this morning. Finishing up, cleaning up the morning keynote sessions. David Albert. David, welcome.
Thank you.
So delighted to have you here. Those of you who are in the live audience, this is your chance to let us know where you're participating from. Look to the left of the map for the star icon. Click on it twice and then click on the map. While you're doing that, you can put your location, time, temperature, anything else you'd like. Oh, Lainey's here from Peru. Lainey gave a great session with her son last night. While we're waiting, you should also have been prompted to get the document titled The Average Giraffe Song. If you didn't get that handout, I'm going to push that out one more time. It's supposed to ask you if you want to download that when you come in the room. Let me know if now you have received the prompt. Michelle says no prompt. Piggy George didn't get it. She's on an iPad. Is anybody getting the prompt? Terrific. That was going to really worry me. Okay, if you didn't get the prompt, put your email in the chat, and when David is starting, I will send it to you by email. And I'm going to turn the time over to David now. Thanks, David.
Well, thank you all. And we're going to talk about giraffes and wolves and everything but homeschooling for a little while. But you'll see it all connects up, I hope. Thank you for having me. It's great to see people from all over the world on this chat. And I'm hoping you get a copy of this song that I sent to you. I would actually have had a link to the music, but there is no link to be had. It exists on exactly one CD, which is copy protected. And I no longer have a copy. I sold it to a homeschooler in Japan. So I don't even have a copy. But I do want to talk to you about this song and why it prompts what I have to say today. So I'm an old encrustified guy who has been struggling with the electronics of this thing this morning. The gremlins are nice, and here I am. But even I am not old enough to have heard this song. It was sung by a group called the Four Lads, a Toronto-based group of crooners. And I never would have experienced the average giraffe if it wasn't for a college roommate back in the dark ages when Collier Stremski was still a name people could pronounce confidently, even if they couldn't spell it. Are there any Bostonians in the audience who remember Collier Stremski? Well, for some reason, this song fit my roommate's rather wry sense of humor. And as I remember, he liked to play it on any day he had exams. So I remembered the song vividly for more than 40 years. So I decided, being the strange homeschooling bird that I am, to try to find out more about it. And as I mentioned, there's nothing to be found about it on the web, other than the album it is from. There were no lyrics, no composer, no information. I bought the CD, actually a 2-CD set, featuring their most famous song, Istanbul, Not Constantinople. And I painstakingly transcribed the lyrics above, and then, as I said, promptly resold the CDs to a homeschooling family in Japan. Well, I wanted to know more. Since this group, the Four Lads, still exists, I tracked down their publicity agent. That took a little time. And after all, as the song says, the average giraffe leads a life that we cannot discuss, For further details, send a card or a letter to us. Well, an email would have to do. The publicity agent, in turn, sent it on to the last living member of the original group, a man named Frank Brusseri, the baritone, and he still performs at age 80 years old. He started singing with what was to become the Four Lads when he was 17. And to my shock and delighted surprise, Frank wrote me back. He doesn't remember who wrote the song. He doesn't remember when the song was first performed. He doesn't remember what prompted the song's composition or why it was written. Well, I can answer the last question. It was written for me. So now I have to tell you something important, which is the title for this talk. The average giraffe sleeps 4.6 hours a day. Believe it or not, I had a reason to ask this question while I was traveling in rural western India, where there have never been any giraffe spottings as far as I'm aware. So, from the Thar Desert in India, I did what any good red-blooded, well-schooled American would do. I looked it up on the internet, and all sites say the same thing. Giraffes sleep 4.6 hours a day. Well, I imagine that students writing high school or college papers on mammalian behavior will find this in their textbooks, those that care to cite this factoid. 7th graders, asked to write essays about their favorite animals, will get extra credit for including this factoid. We all know it is true. It can be found in that pinnacle of all received wisdom, Wikipedia. But the homeschooler in me soon kicked in. I wanted to get to the source. Well, as it turned out, the Wikipedia's font of Wikipedia wisdom is based on one study, published in the Journal of Sleep Research in March 1996, Behavioral Sleep in the Giraffe, Giraffa camelopardalis, in a zoological garden. The authors of this article, I. Tolver and B. Schwerin, of the Institute of Pharmacology, why was pharmacology studying these giraffe sleep? I don't know, at the University of Zurich, a hotbed of giraffe research, they studied exactly 8 giraffes, 5 adults, 2 immature, and 1 juvenile. Only the adults were included in the findings, based on recording of their sleep patterns for 152 nights. And the researchers seem to have utilized some kind of device with transmitters attached to the giraffes' heads to register brain waves. It was also found that giraffe sleep was, quote, redistributed on nights following a day when the giraffe spent a few hours in an outdoor enclosure. You should know they were never allowed out for more than 2 to 6 hours at a time, and that was relatively rare. In other words, our friends at the University of Zurich were studying not only a small number of giraffes in the zoo, but indoor giraffes, who, it is true, on occasional though rare days, were allowed a few hours of recess. So instead of learning that the average giraffe sleeps 4.6 hours a day, what the study actually said is this. 5 adult giraffes of unspecified age, removed far from their native habitats and exposure to the natural elements, kept in captivity almost entirely indoors, and allowed limited outdoor exposure, required to associate themselves with other giraffes not of their own choosing during both waking and sleeping hours, not provided the opportunity to seek out their own food or companionship, with transmitters attached to their heads and being videotaped 24 hours a day for 152 days, averaged 4.6 hours of sleep in a 24-hour period. Now, I might add, we know nothing about the type of the giraffe studied. There are at least 5 different subspecies, and whether the various subspecies get along, where they came from, how long each had been held in captivity, or what kind of or neurological damage each might have suffered in being captured and transported to the zoo. All right, here's the kick. If you think you know anything, generally speaking, about child development. The reality is that virtually all the studies are based on Western children who have been involuntarily confined in their boxes 30-plus hours a week, plus virtual boxes for many, many hours more. Taught and brought up and studied by others who spent and still spend the better part of their lives confined in similar boxes. Who in true, on occasional though rare days, are allowed a few hours of recess. In other words, it is based on the study of indoor giraffes. If you believe you know anything about what children are capable of doing at various ages or stages of physical or social or cognitive development, it is likely based on the study of indoor giraffes. If you think you know anything about children's and youth's so-called addiction to television or video games, it is likely based on the study of indoor giraffes. If you believe you know anything about adolescent rebellion or teen use of alcohol or drugs or teen sex, it is likely based on the study of indoor giraffes. If you think you know anything about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, oppositional defiance disorder, childhood obesity, or an entire panoply of real or fabricated afflictions ostensibly suffered by young people, it is likely based on the study of indoor giraffes. If you believe you know anything about the impact of praise, prizes, gold stars, punishments, or rewards, it is likely based on the study of indoor giraffes. If you have acquired a notion about when teen brains mature, I believe it's about 45. We, especially males, raised indoors, shouldn't be trusted until then, or afterwards either. Or about electrical impulses in the brain, or brainwave activity, it is likely based on the study of indoor giraffes. And as indoor giraffes grow, the world closes in around them, and their necks permanently disfigured, or their heads bumped up against increasingly oppressive ceilings. Even after all the studies are completed, they are, still but rarely, allowed outside for recess. And they are in a permanent state of hurt, and with crooked necks have difficulty ever seeing straight. Who knows what giraffes might be like if freed outdoors again, able to stretch their necks as high or as far as they choose, and seeing as far as their eyes choose to see, reaching up into the highest branches, feeding on stomach foods and nourished by brain foods of their own choosing, once again experiencing the world as great nature intended. Who is willing to express any doubt that in the proper environment and with the proper food and with mentoring by and living examples of those raised up outside of the box, giraffes can and will inevitably and most definitely fly? After all, elephants do. All right, I've talked enough about giraffes. And then I was reminded, this is the way my mind works, so you'll just have to bear with me. I want to talk about wolves. So my daughter, Alia, many of you have met her in my books, she started working at a wolf sanctuary near our home, Wolf Haven International, at the age of 6. It's a renowned wolf sanctuary for captive wolves who could not be released into the wild. It's a story I've told and retold over again, and if you want to see it, it's featured in my first homeschooling book, And the Skylark Sings With Me. Alia studied everything she could get her hands on to learn everything there was to know about wolves. She couldn't get it from me. I'm a New Yorker. For me, the wolf is a big, messy dog. She went to lectures and films on wolf behavior, wildlife ecology, scoured the web. There wasn't nearly as much in those days, and listened carefully to Wolf Haven's education director, to whom she was an apprentice. She honed her spiel to a fine story, Supposedly scientific in its details, but childlike. What would you expect from a 6-year-old in the telling? Well, in those days, the supposed science was that wolves live in a dog-eat-dog, wolf-eat-wolf world. So in order to maintain social cohesion and hunt effectively and produce the best possible offspring, there were careful gradations of leaders and followers. The alpha wolves, the males, got and defend the right to mate with the alpha females. And those are the only ones who get to reproduce. And together these two get to chow down on the best food, which is said to be liver. Yeah. They get to sleep in the best cribs, generally lord it over everyone else. Other wolves bow and scrape before them, even when they're not directly intimidated. And they array themselves in pecking or biting order. There are the beta wolves and the gamma wolves and the delta wolves, all the way down to the omegas, the scapegoats, the scape wolves, who get picked on by everyone, which is important as the scientists say, tension reliever for the group as a whole and promotes group solidarity. If there isn't enough food, the scapegoat goes. Occasionally, there'll be a challenge to the alpha wolf's place in the hierarchy, with the loser going off to lick his wounds and perhaps to wait for another day. Well, this is the vaunted dominance hierarchy, it's called, the supposedly signature social and behavioral characteristic of this unique member of the wild kingdom. Think about it. It sounds so perfect. A cross between corporate America and World Wrestling Entertainment and a Los Angeles street gang. Maybe even school. Everyone can relate. We see ourselves, and we have confirmed that things are as they should be. Well, it turns out that in the world of wolves, and this has actually been known for a long time, left to their own devices, it isn't like this in the least. The description above is true of captive wolves, unrelated, haphazardly thrown together, and forced to get along, often in territories too small for all of them to peacefully coexist without some extraordinary behaviors that violate their natural way of being. In other words, it's more like a state pen, or a school, or Andersonville for wolves. Thrown in together, they develop a fear-based culture, a mode for reducing conflict, and a series of conformist behaviors, which, if not comfortable, at least lowers the tension and allows them to get along, unless one is a scape wolf. When not stressed by drought or compressed into a fixed space or overpopulation, it turns out wolves behave like a benevolent family. There is a breeding pair, a mother and a father, the pack progenitors, and their offspring. The children don't challenge the father and don't try to breed with their mothers. The pack will adopt other young wolves on occasion, sharing their food and conviviality. And when ready, the wolves go off and form other breeding pairs. Yes, the delters and the scape wolves just as often as the so-called higher-ranking members. The so-called submissive stance of the younger wolves turns out to be a behavior designed to get another family member, usually the father, to regurgitate food. But what happens when you cram a bunch of unrelated wolves into a smaller space, make it impossible for them to hunt for their food, and otherwise control their food intake and their ability to seek out new habitat, and then observe them all the time? Well, they pick on each other. They fight. The less strong slink away and essentially try to hide, except when they think they can get food scraps. The males try to have sex constantly, with the stronger males fighting off the weaker ones. The pack develops a pecking order, and the timid, low-ranking wolves don't breed at all. The social hierarchy leaves every one of its members, from top to bottom, under threat. Does this sound familiar? One scholar who spent 13 weeks researching wolf behavior in the wild calls studying wolves in captivity to understand their social structure as analogous to trying to draw inferences about human family dynamics by studying humans in refugee camps. Or I might have added schools. What do we really know about children? Well, first of all, I've suggested a lot less than you might think, given all those graduate schools of education and programs in child development. What we know about children is that, for the most part, confined to the kind of knowledge we have about indoor giraffes or wolves in captivity. And for some strange reason, we think we not only know something about children, but even, in our hubris, about average ones. To a hammer, everything is a nail. To a statistician, everything is a beam. I want to use the remainder of my time to take you on another little intellectual excursion. No more animals. One of the most important figures of the 19th century may have been Charles Darwin, but few people recognize the impact of their lives of his cousin, Francis Galton. It is said of him that he was a true genius and polymath. He was an anthropologist, a tropical explorer, a travel writer, geographer, inventor, meteorologist, and for purposes that I will be addressing here, he was a statistician, psychometrician, and eugenicist. Galton was obsessed with two grand ideas: the need to measure absolutely everything, and the inheritance of human mental characteristics. In statistics, any of you guys into statistics? He's responsible for the terms correlation, regression toward the mean, and the popularization of normal distribution and standard deviation. To simplify to the point of being simplistic, he proposed that normal random variables would distribute themselves statistically along what we have come to call a bell curve. You should look that one up. It makes it. He invented something called a beam machine. It was called a quincunx, Q-U-I-N-C-U-N-X, to demonstrate this bell. By the way, this makes a great Scrabble word, and if you can send it, you can get it 108 points for this word if you get it on the triple word score. This set of ideas is considered the most significant breakthrough in statistics in the 19th century. Why should you care? Here I am. It's only 8:30 in the morning my time, and hopefully it's a little later where you are. Why do I want to talk to you about this? Well, Galton decided to apply this statistical paradigm to human characteristics. It seemed to him logical and borne out by limited data that height would fall along this normal distribution. Now, he never met a particular population where a certain segment or caste had been subject to poor nutrition for several generations, hence stunting their growth, which would have resulted in a large bulge on the lower end of the bell curve. He next decided to apply this principle to human intelligence. But since human intelligence remained undefined and no test for it existed, Galton and his intellectual descendants for the next 100 years have been devising tests whereby intelligence, a single unitary characteristic in a human population, would fall along a bell curve. That the curve and distributions were unstable over time just seemed one of those nasty inconveniences that either had to be explained away, or failing that, the tests had to be improved. Now, the intellectual debates have been hot and heavy since then, but I think it's worth returning to the initial idea. No evidence whatsoever, independent of the tools and else, constructed to show a normal distribution of intelligence exists anywhere to indicate human intelligence falls along a bell curve. It's a theoretical construct subject to what we call reification, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Fancy stuff. It basically says you have a hypothetical design and you treat it as if it were a real event. In other words, you treat as if it is a real thing, something which is not a real thing at all, but just an idea. again, you should care. It has had deadly consequences. Following on his cousin's work, Galton put forward the notion that intelligence is hereditary, follows a normal distribution, and that there is a racial and social class intelligence hierarchy, and that human intelligence cannot be enhanced through environmental changes. He even suggested that the Chinese be encouraged to immigrate to Africa because of their racial superiority. He encouraged eugenic marriages, early marriages among people of high breeding, to improve the race, with incentives to increase the number of their children. This is an idea that goes back to Plato's Republic. Those not gifted with the required intelligence would be expected to repress their urge to procreate or be considered enemies of the state. Schools would take on the role of collecting and regularly updating eugenic information on the stock of the nation. It wasn't long before others, especially in the United States, would expand upon this idea and take it in a more sinister direction. Not only would the breeding among the inferior masses, those are people of non-Northern European descent, as determined on their scores of intelligence tests, be discouraged, their access to better or higher education would be blocked as well. This became a key idea in the development of American education and social policy. Its vestiges still exist today, and it took an even deadlier turn in Germany. And for those of you who think sex education in schools is a new development, the teaching of racial and sexual hygiene, preventing the lesser among us from breeding with those of better quality, I remind you to think about captive wolves, was a regular and required part of public education curriculum in many states through much of the early and mid-20th century. Why should you care? Simply this. The reality is that there are no average children, independent of efforts to standardize them and rank them on the school assembly line. This should be obvious when you observe that children develop at variable rates, that their environments differ, and that different cultural expectations and practices bring us different results. I spend a lot of time in the third world these days. I spend a lot of time in East Africa, in India. It's part of my water work. I hope you'll read about it on our website. It's an organization called Friendly Water for the World, www.friendlywater.net. I help people around the world produce their own clean drinking water supply. We think kids lack developmental readiness to handle knives or fires safely by themselves. Well, I have to tell you, among the FA in the Congo, infants routinely use machetes safely. In New Guinea, children handle knives and fire with care by the time they can walk. In Central Africa, children ages 3 to 4 can cook their own meals over an open fire. In Oceania, children begin to take responsibility for caring for other children, tending their own garden plots, and taking their produce to market to sell, handling all cash transactions by age 4. In West Africa, children from ages 20 months to age 6 travel in packs, the older ones feeding the younger ones and caring for them with no adults involved. We even find differences within highly developed societies and schools. In India, as already noted, many parents assume that children are prepared to learn 3 or more languages by the age of 5. So which children are average? Those who can't be left alone under penalty of law before the age of 14, that's the law in England, or 3 to 4-year-olds who feed and care for 4-month-olds without adult supervision, as in Polynesia. And those child development people, brain scan machines, they aren't attaching their leads to infants in the Congo or 3-year-olds in Polynesia. They are still reserved for giraffes in the zoo and school children. All this is by way of saying that there are no such creatures as average children. They have their own internal development trajectory. Particular proclivities develop at different rates. And all of this is mediated by family and community practices and cultural environments. Once you've removed your children and mentally yourselves, remember the name of my latest book is Dismantling the Inner School, from the school conveyor belt, you don't have to compare anymore. You stepped off the bell curve, out of the world of the Neo-Galtonian bean counters, and you've entered a world which is much wider and more exciting. Once you have banished the ghost of the average child and the ghost of indoor giraffes and captive wolves, you will have made it easier to see your own child's individual genius, and you can spend your energies focusing upon how best to nurture it. Turn off the TV. Turn off the popular child psychologist. Turn off the so-called education experts, including yours truly. Tune out the internet. You are an expert in your own children. You know them better than anyone else. Throw out the rules and guidance, including mine, when they don't fit with your experience. Give your kids a home of safety and security from which they can go out and explore the world. And I can almost guarantee that people will be flocking to you for advice. And you and your children will grow wings alongside my giraffe friends. Thank you.
David, do you want to take questions?
I'd love to.
I think most of the comments are going to be brilliant, beautiful, profound, love it. But if you have a question for David, you can raise your virtual hand, which is the third icon over in the participant window, or you can put it in the chat. You can also just make a comment or a compliment.
Yes, Peggy, you are all experts. But we are pushed and pulled by the things that you hear in the newspaper. I mean, I could go off on what you hear about childhood obesity or sleep or any number of things. I had worked in public health for a good part of my life. I have to tell you, I spent a lot of time in my early career dealing with the after effects of Dr. Spock. Dr. Spock is responsible for the death of tens of thousands of infants, and I know that sounds pretty shocking, but he decided that his science told him that children had to sleep on their stomachs, and tens of thousands of children died. I happen to like Dr. Spock, but the point was, the experts basically study a very limited sample, and they go from there and basically prescribe that for the rest of us when our own experience tells us otherwise.
David, because you work in health and in other areas around sort of social change, what voices do you like that describe the process of helping cultures change their stories around practices?
I'm clearly a disciple of Ivan Illich. He was also John Holt's mentor. Unfortunately, I never met him. I actually had an opportunity and turned it down at one point when I was in my early 20s. That was a mistake. So he would probably be the top of my list. Then I have some people that most of you have never heard of because Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, although again he dealt mostly with adults, but he was important in making us think about the contexts in which education includes. And there are a bunch of people that I studied with in India. Unbelievably extraordinary people in thinking about the needs for education, especially in rural areas. But you've never heard of them. One of them is you could say my guru. His name is Jyoti Bhai Desai. He's 89 now in Gujarat. I visited him last summer. Still doing well. And he was Holt before there was Holt.
What about Manish Jain? Do you know Manish?
Do I?
Correct.
No, I don't.
Well, so one of the interesting things that we talked about last night in Janie's session on world schooling was this question of how social change takes place. And India has this sort of great example of a Gandhian spinning,
yes,
taking back control. Are there ways that you feel as though this movement toward a better understanding of children could be expanded in a similar fashion?
I imagine it's going to have to be mouth to mouth. The dominance of our media and of our education systems are so extraordinarily dominated by our so-called schools of education that I doubt that it's going to happen to any mainstream institutions. Folks who know my work know that I believe that the reason schools don't change is because they are profoundly successful. They're not failing. They're very successful at producing people who find their life satisfactions in the production and consumption of material goods and who will not rebel. And that system is served by our graduate schools of education. They're served by our media. I don't expect change is going to happen from there. I have seen extraordinarily magnificent things happening in the third world among people who have very little contact with us.
Peggy wants to know if she needs permission to share the giraffe story, and I want everybody to know.
Why, sure. And if you send me an email, first I can give you, I have a written copy of what I said today. I can give you just the giraffe story itself. Just send me an email, not a problem.
And I went on Amazon and was able to download the song.
Really?
Yes.
That's great. You want to play it?
I don't think because of the echo cancellation, I think I might play it.
Okay.
Oh, no. Let me try. Hang on. See if you hear this.
Certainly, of course, you do. The average giraffe has a tongue 17 inches long. Oogly oomba, oomba. The average giraffe is a 30 years old.
99 cents or something.
That's great. It must be very recent. And again, no one knows who wrote it or why they wrote it or when they first sang it, so you can make up a story.
Okay, if you have any other comments for David or questions, feel free to put them in the chat or with your virtual hand. David, I obviously need to become more familiar with your work. You mentioned your most recent book. Is there one that you recommend people read first of your material?
You know, you always like your youngest child. I like Dismantling the Inner School, but they're all told in a different fashion. I mean, my first book, And the Skylark Sings With Me, is almost a journal of what we did with our older child up to the age of 10. The next two, Homeschooling and the Voyage of Discovery and Have Fun, Learn Stuff, Grow, got many anecdotes, but discursive essays, generally speaking, short essays. You know, they're kind of reading that a busy homeschooling mom and dad can just sort of fit in around the edges. The next book, which I love, What Really Matters, was a series of dialogues I did with Joyce Reed, who homeschooled five kids on a mountainside in Hawaii without any radio, phone, television, anything of the sort in the 70s. And she then became a dean at Brown University. And I love the dialogue we had. And we got to stretch out our thinking a bit more. And then finally, my most recent book is Dismantling the Inner School, where I take the time and trouble to really stretch out my thinking in new ways with longer discursive essays.
Okay, that leaves a lot of reading for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Which is good. Okay, I don't want to close things off if there are other comments or questions, but we really appreciate David's time and want to be.
I had fun.
We obviously did too. I think unless there's another question, we'll let David go. Thanks, David, so much.
Sure.
Lovely to speak with you.
Okay, take care.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody. We have sessions coming up in 18 minutes. Sure having a fun time this morning. Hope you're enjoying the second and last day of the inaugural Homeschool